Today we're going to talk about multi-index, also known as hierarchical indexes. Great topic. I'll be doing it at a pace today where you can follow along with me and code with me if you'd like. This is definitely for those who are struggling or just beginners and want to understand what a multi-index is. So down below, like this video on YouTube, you'll see a link that says see more. Just open that up and you'll be presented with the code that you can copy and paste into Jupyter Notebook is what I use, or whatever your environment is, that will include the data sets that we'll be using today to create our multi-indexes. We'll start today with series. We'll look at how to create a multi-index from an array and also from tuples. And then we'll do a couple of really cool things. We'll take that series and we'll unstack it and we'll convert it into a data frame. And we'll also look at data frames in the context of multi-indexes and help you get comfortable knowing what it looks like with inside. We will also be pulling data out using indexing. And so that way you get comfortable looking at a multi-index and knowing how to pull data out from it. And lastly, we'll talk about pivot tables. Pivot tables often come up in context of grouping or group by or aggregation or multi-index, and we'll create some, talk about why you would create a pivot table, and hopefully this will be a great event for you. I put some time into this and I hope it's of value for you. So let's get started. First thing to do is to import NumPy as NP and import Pandas as PD, and run your code cell and get those packages installed. So the first thing we want to do is, again, down below that video under See More, open it up and copy this code into your code cell and then run it. And we're just out of the gate going to create a multi-index from an array. Just because I want to talk through it and help you see what we're doing, we will be creating some and talking through it from scratch. But right now, let's just create one and put one on the table. So what you see here is I've created a variable called quarter years, and I've assigned it to pd.MultiIndex, which is the function that we'll use from Pandas to create a multi-index. And then we're going to pull up a method called fromArrays. And you might be asking, why from arrays? Well, I'm going to just pause real quick and ask you to print out the help menu for multi-index. And the way I do this is I just type in to my command line, help parentheses pd.multiIndex, and I just run the code cell. And what I want to point out is if you scroll down a little far, you'll see something that says methods. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can create multi-index from a lot of different methods. We're just going to do from arrays and from tuples today, but I wanted to make sure you know in the context of that help menu where those things are found. So here's from arrays, and if you look at our from array, we've got two of them. We've got years, we've got quarters, and then further down below we have a list of sales. So when you run the code, you'll see that it did indeed create a multi-index. It says it right there when you print it out. So it's like, okay, we've been successful so far. So what I want to do first is let's pass this multi-index into a series and see what it actually looks like. So I'm going to type in ser1_sales. That's what I'm going to call this first series. And I'll pull up Pandas with PD series, and in parentheses I'm going to pass in my data of sales, and then I'm going to pull up my index, and we just created the index, right? It's our multi-index, and that is called quart_years. Underneath that, I'm going to type in ser1_sales so that when I run it, I can see the data. And there we go. Our first multi-index that is a series. Now, if you guys recall a couple things about a series is just one-dimensional. It's just one column of data. That's it. This is not two-dimensional. We can actually see that just by typing in ser1 underscore sales and bringing in ndim. And that'll tell us the number of dimensions here. And that is, sorry about that, it's equal to 1 dimension. Okay, one other thing I want to point out just real quick, when you noticed in our array here, or our list, we had just integers, but if you scroll down here before, it brought it in as float values. And the reason why that is because in our data set here for sales, we actually have null values. And just by default, Pandas is going to convert those integers over to float values. Just something to know or to keep in mind. Okay, so the first thing I want to do here is go ahead and print out a few things about this series. And I often do this when I'm first learning this stuff. I'll print out, which we already did, this number of dimensions, but I'll often print out the type. And in this case, I'm just going to print out the index and the values for this series. And just, you know, just so we have a framework of reference. Again, it's 1 dimension. We have a Pandas series. Our multi-index has these values right here. And then there are our values that are presented within it. So if this makes complete sense to you, great. I'm not going to do this again. But often I share this within other videos as pull in attributes of what it is that you're creating, because it helps you make sure that you know what it is that's being presented to you when you run your code. And at some point you won't probably feel like you need to do this anymore. Alright, so now what we're going to do is create our next multi-index, and we're going to do this from tuples. So tuples, you know, is really, in this case, just going to be in parentheses a couple of values. We're going to put in the value of year, and then we're going to put in the value of a quarter, like first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. So if you look down below this video in YouTube, go ahead and grab the code that starts with tuples. And I will place it here. This is the code you're looking for, and just go ahead and run it. And what you're just running is creating a variable called tuples. Here's our tuples. And then there is our sales value, which is basically the same that we had up above. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to pass these tuples into a series. It's not going to be a multi-index. And I'm going to do this because I kind of want to point out the difference between having these tuples in a multi-index versus not being in a multi-index. So right now we're going to do this where it's not a multi-index. So type in series2 underscore sales and bring in pandas for pd dot series, put in your parentheses, and we'll type in sales for our data, which is right here. And then we're going to pass in our index, which is going to be equal to tuples. And then underneath that, go ahead and type in ser2 underscore sales so that you can, when you run the code, see your data. So this is still a series. It's still 1 dimension of data. There's just 1 column, and here's the index value that's associated with the value that's in that column. So now what I'm going to do is we're actually going to take ser2, we're going to replace this index, these values here, with a multi-index. Okay? So let's first create our multi-index. And feel free to pause if you like at this point, if you think you can do this. If not, it's all good. There's a lot to learn here. Let's call this multi-index index 2. And we're going to make that equal to pd for pandas, and we're going to pull up our function of multi-index. And then we're going to pull a method off that, because remember I opened that up earlier when we printed out the help menu and there was like from arrays, from tuples. We're going to do this from tuples. bring in our data for our first parameter, and then we're going to name like the years with years and the quarters with quarters. So I'll type in names equal to, and because we're doing this as a list, I'm going to bring in brackets, and we're going to do year and quarter. And then underneath that, go ahead and type index 2 to print it out when you run it. And there's our multi-index. Okay, good so far. Now what we have to do is we have to pass this multi-index into that series. Now remember before I said we're just going to take this series and replace this multi-index with the index that's there. And the reason why I'm doing this is because there's a real useful function called reindex. We're going to use it as a method. So we're going to type in ser3 underscore sales, which is just a new series we're creating and just calling it that. You can call this anything you would like. ser3 underscore sales is equal to ser2 underscore sales, which was our data that we created up here that was not a multi-index. And we're going to bring in the method of reindex. And we're going to pass in our multi-index, which we just created right here, and we called it index 2. So we'll type in index 2, and then underneath it, I will type in ser3 underscore sales and run it, and voila. So now we have a multi-index. We have our year, we have our quarter. Remember, we got that by passing in the names when we created that multi-index. And then associated with that is the value itself. Okay, so this again is still a series, it's still one-dimensional. And let's go ahead and just take a minute and pull a couple of things out of this multi-index and grab the associated values. So we'll type in ser3 underscore sales, and let's say I want to pull in everything that's part of 2019. So I'm just going to type in 2019 and then run that. And there's everything associated with 2019. We've got the quarter and we got the values. And of course, another way to do this is to type in .loc, which allows you to pass in string values for the index and run that, and you get generally the same thing. Well, exactly the same thing. So let's say I want to pull in the value of 2760 that I've highlighted up there in blue. The way to do that is you go ahead and pass in the first index value and that second index value, and in this case it's going to be Q2, and I'm going to run that, and there's my value of 2760. Okay, so what happens if I change this to iLoc and I put 0 in there? So iLoc stands for, looking for something based upon its integer value. These are not integer values for these indexes. These are strings. If you remember when we brought this in, we passed these in as string values. And so what the iLoc does is it looks for things based upon the integer index, and if you are familiar with this, 0 is the first row. And so this will bring back our first row of data, which is 1456, and we only see 1456. We don't see 2019 or Q1 because that 2019 and Q1 is equal to the index value of 0. Okay, so when you think of indexing and pulling values out, think of it going from the outside to in. So we did before earlier when we typed in 2019, let's pull in 2020. Okay, we're starting from the outside, right? And so, whoops, goodness. iLoc does not work. It's a string value. So if you type in .loc and you start off from the outside, 2020 is going to bring you everything associated with 2020. And then lastly, if you want to go deeper in, then index by your next value. And let's say we want to pull in 3360. We'll pull in Q2 and we'll run this, and there's 3360. All right, we'll do more of this as we go along. So now we're going to do something really cool. We're going to take this series, we're going to unstack it, and we're going to create a two-dimensional data frame. And so we want to unstack this so the years are the rows and the quarters are actually the columns in our data frame. So there's a really cool function called unstack. We're going to use it as a method here. So let's type in DataFrame1 and we'll call it DataFrame1 underscore sales or df1 underscore sales. And we're going to make that equal to ser3 underscore sales, which is our series here that is a multi-index. And we'll add the method of unstack, put in our parentheses, and then right underneath that we'll add df1 underscore sales so that we can see what it looks like. So again, what this is doing is it's unstacking this series that has a multi-index into a two-dimensional data frame. And we know it's two dimensions because there's just rows of columns, and we can also double check it by just typing in ndim. And there's your value. You can also look at the shape of it if you're just curious and want to make sure that you know what it is that you're creating or building. Run it again and you say it has a shape of 3 by 4, which is just 3 rows, 4 columns, and it's just 2 dimensions because there's just 2 values being passed there. Okay, so let's shift gears now and let's create a pivot table of data. And the reason why you create pivot tables is because you want to sum up the data. So multi-index is great, and summing up data is great too. So pivot tables work so great for just summing up data or counting data or doing things that you need to aggregate data. So if you're familiar with pivot tables from Excel, this is really the same thing. It just is being done within Pandas. So let's create a data frame and call it df2, and we will bring up Pandas. We'll type in our data frame, and let's pass in our series 3 underscore sales series, and we will name the columns. There's just one column because from a series it's only one dimension with one column of data, and we know that that data set in there is sales, so we'll just call it sales. And then type in df2 just to present it. Okay, so there is our data frame. So this is a multi-index data frame because remember, series had a multi-index, series 3 underscore sales, and so it passed that index over to that data frame, which is very important. So let's just go ahead and pull some data out of the data frame. Works very similar to the way it did with the series, so that's why I didn't spend a whole lot of time on that. We'll do a few other things with this one as we pull out data. So to pull it out, we'll type in df2, which is what this thing is named, and we'll type in .loc, as we know that that's going to pull in index values that are strings, and we'll type in 2021 and start from the outer. So now we've selected the outer level of 2021, and we're pulling in things associated with it, and there we have the index values of Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and our sales values. So if we wanted to go inside and just pull in this Q1 value, you should know how to do that now because we just did it earlier. And we'll type in Q1, which will pull in 3780, and then we'll run that, and there's our value of 3780. Now let's say we wanted to pull in like 2019 and 2020 and just those 2 years. Well, we can do that as well by pulling in or bringing in a list, and we'll type in 2019 and then subsequently 2020. And there's our subset of data where we used indexing just to pull in, pieces of that data set. And again, we're just pulling in a subset of that data. Okay. All right, so let's now create our pivot table, and we're going to aggregate things by summing up the values from each of these years, 2019, 20, and 21. So pivot tables, it's called pivot table for the function itself. We'll use it as a method off of df2. So let's put in df2, make sure we're all on the same page here. Here's our data set for df2. So we're going to name this df2 underscore pivot. We'll make that equal to df2 dot pivot table, pivot underscore table, and that'll be the method that we're going to use to create our pivot table. And if you go to the help menu, you'll find out all these things I'm doing right now, but the first thing that we place in here is I'll place in the values. We want sales. That's going to be the data that we're going to be summing up. Our index, we want to do this by year. We mentioned that earlier. And then the last thing is we need to bring in our aggregation function, and we're going to make that equal to sum. We'll go ahead and then run this. And what did I do wrong there? Pivot table got an uninspected argument value. Oh, goodness. It's values. So, hey, I'm glad. So I'll run that again. I got another error message, and it said key error is year. And that is because I didn't capitalize it. Another good thing to point out is you need to make sure that you have your lower and uppercase correct. And there is our multi-index that has been now taken and used within our pivot table function to sum up values based upon something that was in that multi-index, and it was year. So pretty cool stuff. Alrighty, so what we're going to do now is we're now going to unstack df2, and there's a really cool thing about this. I'm going to take df2, unstack it, and I'm going to take these years, and they're going to end up being rows. The quarters are going to end up being columns, and then our data is going to be presented within the columns. So we'll type in df2 dot unstack our parentheses, run it, and voila. How cool is that? Okay, so now we're going to shift gears. We're going to build a multi-index from a data frame. And so what I'd like you to do is go ahead and copy that code that I have down below. Again, if you look at the see more down below the YouTube video, you'll be presented with some coding options, and this is what you need. It starts with employees, ends with employees. So paste that in there and run it. So here's a data frame of data, and we have 4 columns. Here's our indexes by default. It starts it out at 0 and goes to 10. Okay, so let's go ahead and now set our index. And we're going to create a multi-index by using a setIndex function. We're going to pass it as a method here. But I'm going to call this mi for multi-index equal to e's, or mi underscore EEs is equal to employees dot set underscore index. That's our method. We'll type in parentheses, give ourselves some brackets, and we want to do a multi-index by department. That's going to be the outer part of the multi-index, and then we'll do it by position. And then underneath that, we'll type in what we've named this as, which is MIEEs, and then we'll run it. How cool is that? We created our multi-index. But this doesn't look very good. Things need to be sorted here, and so we actually can pass a sort underscore index function. So I'll go MIEEs and then dot sorts underscore index, and I want to do this and keep it in place. So basically I'm saying, hey, when you run this thing, keep the data now as is presented, as opposed to just changing it back to what it was before if you rerun mi underscore EEs. So I'll type in place is equal to true. And the reason why this is by default is because, you know, a lot of times in place is used like all over the place. And in place, if you want to remove like columns or remove data, by default it says false because it doesn't want to like have you accidentally remove things and not being able to call it back again. So if you really mean is like, oh yeah, I really want you to do this function and keep it in place, and I'm not going to have it go backwards, this is why you do in place. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, and let's go take a look at this. MIEEs. Check it out. That looks a lot better. All right, now it's sorted. Now it looks very, very, very nice. So let's go ahead and do a little challenge here. I'd like for you to pull out a subset of this data, and I only want the Department of HR and Service, and I only want the employees. So I want Department of HR, Service, and just the employees. That's all I want. Give it a shot. All right, let's go ahead and do that. mi underscore EEs dot LOC. We're using LOC because we're going to be doing this based upon the string values. And so the first thing I want is, I'm going to do double brackets because I have to do a list of a couple things. I want HR and I want service. Okay, good so far. And now the next thing I want is just to pull in the EEs. So I'll just type in EE name and go ahead and run that. Okay, there we go. HR department, service department, there are our employees, and it brought in the positions because it was part of that index. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a pivot table. And let's say you want to produce a headcount report of people by department and how many people are in it. So a very common thing done within HR is to pull headcount reports. So let's go ahead and do that with a pivot table. So we know that there's the aggregation function can't be summing or meaning or using a mean of anything. We're going to have to do it based upon a count. And so let's go ahead and type in our data frame, which is employees, and run it so we know what we're looking at. Okay, all right. Let's type in employees. And do you remember the function that we're going to call as a method? Pivot. Pivot underscore table. Okay, awesome. And put in parentheses. And we're going to do this by EE name. This is just the data that I'm going to use to count things by. They're all distinct values. It'll work perfectly. The index I want to do things is we said we want to do this by department. So I'll type in department. And then we remember last time that we've got to do an aggregation function. We're not going to use sum or mean. We're going to use count. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, and hey, cool. There's our headcount data. Here's our departments. HR has 4 people, sales has 6, and service has 1. Okay, so hopefully this video was very helpful for you. Thank you for watching it, and have a fantastic day.